So today we're going to be looking at the 7 principles of American government. These are the principles which underlie the basic structure of government in American society. So the first principle is the idea of popular sovereignty, and that just basically means that the people rule. We are not ruled by a king or a dictator or any other individual or small group of people. The power is derived directly from the people, and this idea is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. That idea that was relevant in that period, and perhaps others, is that if people do not like their rulers, then they have the right to replace them. So the second principle is republicanism, and that just basically means that we vote for representatives who then go and do the business of government for us so that we can go around and live our daily lives. So this is an underpinning principle of the government of the United States of America. It is not the ideology of the Republican Party as it exists in the year 2020. So we elect representatives, they go and do the business of government for us, and then periodically we check in on them, and those are called elections. And if we like the work that our representatives are doing for us, then we usually re-elect them. And if we don't like the work that is being done by our representatives, then elections give us the opportunity to vote those people out. The basis of a republicanism comes from the ancient Roman Republic. That was the first government, at least in Western societies, that allowed the people to choose their leaders. Now, in the Roman Republic, it was not everybody in Rome gets to vote. It was, of course, only wealthy landowners, in the same way that in the early days of our republic, it was also only wealthy landowners that got to choose. So ultimately, of course, with popular sovereignty, the power is invested in the people, but we then have this mechanism by which we don't have to do all of the business of government all the time. So, the next principle is called separation of powers. Now, in America, we have 3 branches of government, and each of those branches have certain powers that were given to them under the Constitution, and we want to make sure that none of those 3 branches ever becomes too powerful. If you allow one particular branch to wield more power than the other ones, then you start shifting towards a different form of government. So the separation of powers, an example would be that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but the legislature, the Congress, gets to decide how much money the military gets, right? So that would be an example of one power funding the military belongs to the legislature, and another power running the military goes to the executive branch. So the next principle is called checks and balances, and it's very closely related to the previous principle of separation of powers. So what we've done is we've separated the powers, but what we want to do now is make sure that no particular branch of government has too much power. And so it becomes the responsibility of the other 2 branches to make sure that no one single branch becomes too powerful. So a recent example of checks and balances would be an impeachment, right? So President Trump was impeached in February of 2020. And the reason was that the legislature, which has the power of impeachment, has accused the president of high crimes and misdemeanors. And so once that happened, so basically the Congress said to the executive, meaning the president, you did bad things. And so we're going to put you on trial for those things. So that's just a very broad example of how the executive branch can be checked by the legislative branch. But it goes in every direction. So another example would be the legislature approves nominees to the Supreme Court. right? So that is a way that the legislature has a check over the judicial branch, is if the president nominates someone to be on the Supreme Court and the legislature, the Senate, doesn't like it, then that person is not going to be placed on the Supreme Court. There are many, many examples of checks and balances between the three branches. So another way that power is limited or shared in the United States is the fact that we have, well, states. And states have certain powers that the federal government does not have, and the federal government has certain powers that the state does not have. So for example, New Mexico does not have its own army. So, because the military is going to be run at the federal level. Now, we do have National Guard that can be called out by the governor in certain instances. But if the federal government doesn't want the National Guard to be called out, then it isn't, because the military is supervised by the federal government. On the other hand, public education is run by the states. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government can do anything about public education, partly because public education didn't exist as it does now when the Constitution was written. So the federal government can make suggestions about education. It can provide additional funding for education, for, say, like school lunch programs or things like that. But they cannot walk into a state and say, sorry, you're teaching that particular concept wrong. You have to do it this way. Another example of a state power would be things like road maintenance. Other than federal highways like, 25, the roads and public works and things like that are typically left to state or local governments, as long as those things don't violate the Constitution. So it's a very important separation there. And one of the things that we're unfortunately seeing in the era in which we're living now is that coronavirus response is unfortunately being left to the states. And as a result, different states are responding in different ways, some better and some worse. So the next principle is limited government. And the basic idea there is that we are not governed by people, we are governed by laws. And if our government wants to give itself new powers, then it has to pass new laws, and those laws are going to be passed by the people's representatives. And if the people decide that they didn't like the law which was passed, then the people have the right in the next election to replace their representatives and perhaps even change new laws. Another important concept here is that no person is above the law, even the president. So we had a situation not too long ago where the president tried to assert that he was not bound by certain laws, and the Supreme Court ruled that no, in fact, even the president is bound by the laws which limit everyone else. So the government can't just do whatever it wants. And we wouldn't want to have a government that can do whatever it wants. But there have to be laws which bind everyone. So the last principle is individual rights. And this was something that there was disagreement about at the Constitutional Convention, because some of the founders said, we don't need to have a Bill of Rights because the Bill of Rights is going to be implied in everything that the government does. And other people at the Constitutional Convention said, no, that's crazy. We want to make sure that we have certain specific rights that are right there in the Constitution that says this is a thing that the people have or that the government has. And then that document was brought together, and we now know that as the Bill of Rights. And there are some very important rights. And we have a lot of important issues in our society today that relate directly to these rights. So freedom of speech is an example of a right. It's in the First Amendment. We have the right to bear arms in this country. That's the Second Amendment. So there's a whole bunch of specific things that are put into the Bill of Rights because the founders wanted to make sure that an all-powerful government did not infringe on the people's rights. And I think that it's pretty clear that the founders that thought that it was important to have a Bill of Rights, they got that one right, because some of the most important things that are the underpinning of American society are based upon what's in the Bill of Rights. Like we said before, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, um, protection against self-incrimination in a court or in a trial. So we hold these rights to be dear. Now, there's certainly arguments over some of these rights. Certainly, there are a lot of people who have a different perspective on, for example, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Um, there are other positions as well. There is in the 14th Amendment something called equal protection under the law. That seems fairly non-controversial, but then when we start applying it to issues of the day, like immigration, it gets a little bit more muddy. And part of the reason why we have a Supreme Court is to help us with some of these issues where the Constitution isn't very explicit, and we need someone or some entity to help us determine what we think the Constitution actually says and what the founders actually meant. So, those are the 7 principles of American government, and I thank you for staying all the way to the end.